Hey guys, today we're going to talk about putting together your first sewing kit. And I thought that since you guys are putting together your sewing kits, that I would show you mine. This is my sewing kit, and mine is much too large for what you guys are going to be doing in theater class. But I wanted to demonstrate to you that your sewing kit can grow along with you. I still have in this very large kit all of the basics that I'm going to require that you guys have in yours. So let's take a peek inside and see what all you guys are going to need. The first item on your sewing kit list is a couple of sharps needles. Now, if you are putting your sewing kit together yourself and not purchasing one that's already pre-put together, then you're probably going to grab one of these assorted needle packs, and that's totally fine. It has what you're looking for, but not every needle in here is going to be appropriate for what we're going to do. If you look on the back, it will tell you that there are a bunch of different kinds of needles in this pack, and not all of them are going to do what we need them to do. In fact, some of them are going to make us mess up. So let's look inside at the needles that are included in this kit. These big dudes over here on the end, you'll know them because they're almost as thick as a pencil lead. They're really thick needles, and they have a giant eye on them. These are tapestry needles. Excuse my dirty fingernails. I've been working with some stuff today. These are tapestry needles, and like I said, they're just about as thick as a pencil lead, and the eye on them is just enormous, to the point I could just about, in fact I can, get my fingernail actually inside them. There, if you can see, I've got my fingernail all the way through that eye. They're huge, and we don't need these because our stitches aren't gonna stay if we're using this kind of needle. So we appreciate them when we're doing tapestry work, but we are not doing tapestry work. Beside them, we have embroidery needles, and while they are smaller, they are thinner, and they are a little shorter. So it's got an eye that is much too large, and what will actually end up happening is this kind of embroidery needle, because we're not using embroidery floss, will tear a hole in our fabric as we are working with it. So we want to use something that's got a smaller eye than this. What we're looking for are sharps. So we're going to put this embroidery needle back in its package. So down on the very end here, we've got some that have smaller eyes, but they're really long. If I line all these guys up, you'll be able to see. We don't want these guys on the end that are really super long. We're looking for our dudes in the middle. And the dudes in the middle, like this guy right here, I'm pulling him just about from the center of the pack. This particular needle is very thin. He's very short. He's only about 1.5 inches long. In fact, I'm going to get a tape measure out and I'm going to measure this guy. How long are you, my friend? We are just shy. We're about 1.3 inches. We are just shy of 1.5 inches here. I know I don't have him quite lined up properly. But this is what we want. We want something very thin with that very tiny eye on him. And that tiny little eye is going to prevent us from tearing holes that are too big. That's going to keep our knots from slipping through. And this is what we're looking for here. These smaller guys are actually a lot easier to work with than the big long ones too. So this is what we're looking for. You want a couple of sharps like this guy right here to put in your sewing kit. The second item on your list is going to be some thread. Now, I do a lot of sewing, and so I have a lot of varieties of thread. You are going to need one spool of all-purpose or general-purpose thread. I would like you to choose something that is in a contrasting color to the fabric that you pick out. So, for example, if I use this little navy blue piece of fabric, then I could use this pink thread, or I could use this bright yellow thread up here. I could use my white thread that I've got over here, but I would want to stay away from the black thread or from the navy blue thread for our projects for class. While I am still teaching you guys about stitches and how to do them properly, I need to be able to clearly see your work. So I'm asking that you choose a thread that is in a contrasting color to the fabric that you're working with so that I can very easily see your stitches. Now, specialty thread can be a lot of fun. So for example, this is gold thread. This is actually a plastic material, but this is metallic gold thread that is a lot of fun. The issue is that it's plastic and it's really kind of cantankerous to work with. And for a beginning sewist, I feel like this is probably not quite what you're looking for. I feel kind of like Hagrid in Harry Potter telling you to go with the pewter cauldron instead of the gold cauldron, despite the fact that the gold cauldron is a lot more fun. Stay away from metallic threads because that is too advanced for you right now. Same deal goes for denim thread. You don't need it. It's super strong, but you don't need it for this project that we are doing. Especially not the heavy duty top stitching thread that you would get for a pair. This gold color, this is not metallic, but this is the gold top stitching thread that you would see used on a pair of blue jeans. It's super thick, and it's way too much for what we're working with. You want to avoid upholstery thread. Upholstery thread is easy to spot because it feels, if you've ever felt a horse's tail, this feels like horsehair. It's super thick, and it's going to be too much for what we're trying to work with. What you want is a good, general, all-purpose thread. You are looking for something that says all-purpose on the top. It does not matter the yardage. It does not matter if it is full cotton or if it is linen thread or if it's polyfiber or rayon fiber. What you need is that it says all-purpose on the top. Now, if you get it on one of these little round plastic guys, this is called a bobbin. And that's great to have around if you were going to be doing any machine sewing, but you don't necessarily need it. One of those little tiny spools that come in a thread kit is going to be completely fine, but you need to make sure that whatever color you pick, whatever fiber it is, that you pick out your all-purpose thread. What you don't want is this stuff right here. This is embroidery floss. And if you look at it up close, I'm going to use the red. What you're actually dealing with when you've got a piece of embroidery floss is several individual threads that have been twisted together to form this floss, to form this big, thick piece of rope. If I can get it undone, you can see what I'm talking about here. Yeah, there we go. So that's embroidery floss. This is way too thick for what we're doing for our project. So stay away from embroidery floss. Make sure that whatever you pick out says all-purpose thread and that it comes on a spool. It does not come in something that looks kind of like that. I've also asked that you have some sort of marking implement in your sewing kit. I strongly recommend getting a washable, water-soluble fabric marker like this guy right here. This is called the Mark Be Gone. And basically, if you take the lid off of this guy, you've got a standard blue, almost like a felt tip pen going on, and you can mark on any for this particular one, any light colored fabric. And as soon as you throw it in the wash, that mark disappears. What I like about this is that the marks don't rub off. So you can work with this pen, and put any mark that you need to on your fabric, and the mark stays where you put it until you put your project in the washing machine. I have also been known for darker colored fabrics to use a regular wet erase marker or even a dry erase marker, or even sometimes a Crayola washable marker. You just want to test a small piece of your fabric first and make sure this is actually going to wash off. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck with some unsightly marker marks. And if you buy a pre-made sewing kit, odds are they're going to come with one of these quilter's pencils or a marking pencil. Sometimes they're chalk pencils, or sometimes they're like this one that has, it's broken right now, but it's got a silver lead in it. This is also going to wash off of fabric. The reason I don't recommend this for a new sewist is that these marks tend to rub off as you're working with them. So if you are not an experienced sewer, then you're going to struggle with having your marks disappear on you while you're working with them. The next item on your list is a pair of sharp scissors or fabric shears. Now let's talk about cutting implements here for a second. These right here are, sorry, my kid is falling apart. These are my fabric shears and I love them. But you'll notice that these guys are not straight down from the handle the way a normal pair of scissors would be. These guys are actually designed to lay flat so that I can be working with them without really having to pick my fabric up off of a nice smooth table surface. And that is going to allow me to make more accurate cuts. The blades of these shears are also super sharp, and they can dull pretty quickly. So you only ever use fabric shears on fabric. You never, ever use fabric shears on anything other than fabric. You do not use these, despite the fact that they're super freaking sharp. You do not use these to open Amazon packages. You don't use these to open plastic clamshell packaging. You only use these guys on fabric. Now, these are pretty big. Compared to my hand, these are really large. And for a beginning sewer, they're probably a little more power than you're actually going to need if you're only ever going to do minor repairs. You probably don't need a giant pair of really heavy duty fabric shears. So instead, you can grab yourself a mini pair. Now these are made by Westcott. They're the same company that made my fabric shears. In fact, they are sewing snips. They are much smaller. You see, compared to the size of my hand, they are much smaller than the other pair. These would fit in a small sewing kit. They are equally as sharp, and you really only are ever going to use these to make minor cuts, like snipping off a little bit of excess fabric here or snipping threads. And that's pretty much all you're going to do for projects for my class. So a small pair of very sharp scissors is fine, just as long, test them and make sure that they are actually going to cut fabric. And as long as they are actually going to cut fabric, then they are plenty. Now, while we're on the topic of cutting devices, there are some other kinds of cutting devices that you may run across and have some questions about. In fact, one of them is going to show up on your exam. This guy right here is called a rotary cutter. And it almost looks kind of like a pizza cutter. And you use this to keep your fabric laying perfectly flat on a surface, and you press into the fabric. And you're pretty much only going to use this for cutting out shapes for quilting. I haven't really seen, I'm not saying that nobody has ever used a rotary cutter for garment sewing, but I've only really ever seen these rotary cutters used for quilting sewing, for making craft projects as opposed to making wearing projects, garments and things. But this other type of cutting instrument I see used with garments and with crafting all the time, and these are pinking shears. Pinking shears have these zigzag teeth on them, and they are intended to cut fabric that is very likely to fray, fabric that's got a very loose weave on it. You use these pinking shears to cut the zigzag shape into them to keep that fabric from fraying until you can get it to a sewing machine, or until you can get it hemmed down yourself. So you will maybe possibly, depending on some projects that you do for Miss Street over the next couple of years of school, you might run into these pinking shears. You might be expected to know how to use them. You snip them just like a normal pair of scissors, but you use these on fabrics like tulle or chiffon or gossamer that have a very loose weave and are very likely to fray. In your sewing kit, I'm asking you to have some fabric ready to go. So I've got this piece right here that I grabbed at Walmart from the Waverly collection. This is called a fat quarter. So a fat quarter is the excess material that they couldn't sell off of a bolt. And they're awfully handy for small craft projects. If you want to pick up a fat quarter, they come in all kinds of colors and patterns. Have fun with this. However, you do not have to go out and buy fabric. All I am asking is that you pick a material that is a cotton. So this one is a 100% cotton, or linen. Pick a natural fiber material, please. If you want to use an old cotton t-shirt for your projects, that is 100% fine with me, provided you have permission to cut it up, because you will be expected to cut up your sewing projects. The next item that you're going to need for your sewing kit is either a seam gauge or a small ruler. If you already have a small ruler from a geometry kit that you want to use, enjoy yourself, have a good time. But if you plan to actually do some sewing, may I recommend that you go ahead and invest in our friend, the seam gauge. This is what it looks like. For all intents and purposes, it's a ruler, except that it's got this little blue bit in the middle right here. This is a seam gauge up close. And what we're working with here is a regular ruler that's got the addition of this little slidey plastic marker on it. I'm going to remove the tape from the last time I set this for a project. And what you do is you take this little marker and you slide it to keep a consistent notch on what usually your seam allowance is going to be. So let's say I'm doing, I don't know what this project would be that I would need a 2-inch seam allowance, but let's say I need to mark something 2 inches, and I'm going to have to make a ton of these marks going all along the edge of a piece of fabric. So I could take the time, if I didn't have that, I could take the time, I'm going to get my sample fabric out, to find it and mark it. And then I move it and I got to find 2 inches again and mark it. And then I move it and I got to find 2 inches again and mark it. And that's fine. It just takes forever. The seam gauge, the only thing that makes it different from a regular regular ruler is this marker. So I slide that into place, and let's see, for whatever reason, I want to mark something that's 2 inches. I can put the marker where I want it and then take a piece of tape and just tape that down. So once I've got my marker in place, I'm going to put my pencil in this little hole right here, line up my marker with the edge of my fabric, and I just slide. And it's so much faster to mark using a seam gauge. So like I said, you do not have to have one of these. You do need a ruler. If your sewing kit comes with one of these fabric tapes, that's totally fine. You can use a fabric tape. If you have a regular small ruler from a geometry kit, that's totally fine. But if you plan on continuing in your journey of learning how to sew, I strongly recommend go ahead and buy one of these guys. They make life so much easier. I've asked you to buy a small pack of buttons to include in your sewing kit. I recommend, just for life in general, get yourself a jar. And every time you buy a shirt or a jacket that comes with that little plastic baggie of buttons, like, for example, I just bought a new coat and it came with this little plastic baggie of extra buttons. Use your little spice jar or whatever that you have picked out to be your button jar. And every time you get one of these little plastic baggies, open it up. Instead of throwing those extra buttons away or putting them in your junk drawer for them to get lost for time immemorial, put them in your button jar. And so that way, number one, if you lose a button from that particular garment, you know that you can look in your button jar to get it. But number two, buttons can be used in a number of different kinds of sewing projects. You can make earrings out of them. You can make cute little ornaments out of them. So you're going to want a couple of buttons that are the style that have the holes in the middle, as opposed to the style as opposed to a fabric covered button like this one that has the hole on the back only, because that is the kind of button that this kind of button that has a hole, either the 4-hole variety or the 2-hole variety. These are the buttons that you're going to run into most often in life and most likely going to need to repair. So that's why I want you to have these kinds of buttons. You don't need to buy, one of those $10 big giant jars of buttons. Just have a couple of buttons in your sewing kit so that they're ready for when we get to the button sewing portion of our project. Now that we have gone through all of the items that are necessary for your sewing kit, there's one more thing that we need, and that's a box to keep it all in. Now, I love Big Bertha here. I love my big giant sewing kit because it's got all of these little compartments that help me keep everything organized. But you guys are not ready for She's biting me. Oh no. You guys are not ready for a Big Bertha. Here, you guys don't need something quite this large. So may I recommend just grabbing an empty box that you've got laying around the house. So for example, this is the box that my cell phone came in. It's a hard cardboard all the way around, and it's big enough that I can keep a small pair of scissors. I can keep a spool of thread. I can keep my pack of needles. I can keep my ruler and my marker and some buttons. It's big enough that I can keep all of the implements that I need inside of it. And then it has a lid that fits snugly so that none of my items are going to fall out. In fact, when I travel and I need to take some sewing items with me because I'm worried, for example, I know we're going to be going out to a nice dinner on a trip. And I want to make sure that I'm ready in case that I need to repair a button on something or fix a hem real quick. Then I will use this exact box and stick it in my suitcase because it's really light. It's really easy to pack. You could keep one of these little small cell phone boxes or something like it in your backpack with your sewing kit in it, ready to go, so that you never have to worry about being able to find all of your sewing materials. So that's it, folks. That's how to put together your very first sewing kit and make sure that you've got all of the items necessary for minor repair sewing projects. Now, you've probably got some questions, and feel free to ask me those, but some of the most common are going to be, number one, Ms. Street, can I just go buy a pre-made sewing kit? And the answer to that is absolutely. If you can find one for under $10 that has all of these necessary items, then go for it. My only caution is that if you get one of the super cheap sewing kits that are like $2 or below dollars, the little pair of scissors that come with them are not worth a flip. Spend the extra $5 to get the kind that has the good pair of scissors that come with it already. A good way to check is if the pair of scissors is smaller than your thumb, it probably won't even do a good job of snipping threads, let alone cutting fabric. Miss Street, what if I have this stuff lying around my house? Do I have to go buy anything? No. If you've got these materials laying around your house, make sure you've got permission from your mom or dad to collect them and use them at school. But absolutely, you do not have to spend any money. Miss Street, what do I do if I really and truly can't afford a sewing kit, or I've got everything except for a pair of scissors or whatever, and I can't afford it? What do I do? That's when you send me a private message, send me an email, or come talk to me privately after class, and I will hook you up. I will make sure that you have the necessary materials that you need. There are a couple of other things that I recommend having that I don't require having. One of them is our handy friend, the seam ripper. This is what a seam ripper looks like. Its job is literally only for fixing mistakes when you sew. If you are not planning to do any sewing beyond the projects that we're going to do in Miss Street's class, then save your $2. But if you plan to continue on your sewing journey, learning the different kinds of sewing techniques that are available, and maybe even getting to the point where you can alter your own garments so that you can go to the thrift shop and get a high-end garment and then tailor it to suit it, exactly to your body and end up spending less than you would spend on a garment at Walmart for something high-end, then it's worth getting one of these guys. This is mine. They do actually come pretty small. I've seen them. This one is about 7 inches or so in length, but I have seen them that come even as small as your pinky finger. So I recommend having one of these dudes if you plan to do any sewing in the long term. Another question that if you've got a grandmother or someone in your family who sews is likely to ask is, well, how come she's not recommending that y'all get any kind of pins? Because they're hard to keep up with. Honestly, if you're going to have a portable sewing kit like we're making for our class, they're really tough to keep up with. They end up all in the carpet or in the bottom of your backpack. It's bad news bears. However, if you are not just that, you don't need them. It takes exactly the same amount of time to baste a project as it does to pin a project. And people who really love their pins don't like for you to say that. I was in that camp for a long time. I have a crap ton of pins, but it depends on the project, honestly. But for most purposes, especially early sewing purposes, basting is going to do the same thing as pinning, and it saves you having to buy extra equipment. But if you are somebody who plans to do some sewing long term, then I actually have 2 more recommendations for you. If you are going to get pins, you need a pin cushion. But may I strongly suggest that instead of a cushion, you get a pin magnet. You can get these things in the sewing section at any craft store or any big box store that's got a craft section. Literally, it's a piece of plastic that's got a magnet inside it. And that's, if you've got any kinds of pins, and I've got some safety pins here. I've got some, I have a brooch that I never got around to attaching anything to, and I've got some straight pins, and I'll show you those up close there. Straight pins have the little, sometimes they have a T shape on the end, sometimes they have the little ball on the end. But straight pins, when somebody tells you, you need some pins if you're going to sew, straight pins are what they're talking about. So if you've got some pins for a project and, oh no, I'm starting to drop them everywhere, then you get that magnet. Let me tilt you down so you can see what's going on here. And you're done. You've picked up all your pins. And they can live here. They don't have to live in a pin cushion. Now, there's some advantages to the old school pin cushion, especially if you get the kind that has the little grit pin sharpener attached to it. That's great. But again, if you're not going to be doing, especially crafting sewing like quilting, you really don't need pins. You can do pretty much everything you want to do garment sewing wise, at least until you get into really advanced projects with basting stitches instead of pins. Okay. So there's my little speech about pins. One last thing that I will say is if you are somebody who struggles with your thread tangling a lot, it is worth investing in one of these dudes. This is a chunk of beeswax, and they come in these little containers. In fact, do I have an unopened package? I think I do, actually, because I was going to give it as a gift to somebody. So they come in packages that look like this, that say beeswax on them, and it's just a little plastic container with a little dial of beeswax inside it. If you are somebody who struggles with your thread knotting a lot while you're sewing, you can spend the money to get these. I use regular beeswax because it's organic, because it's easy to work with, because that's what I was trained to do, because it melts when you rub it in your fingers. But for a very, very beginning sewer, get a tea light candle. Get one of these little tiny guys. You can get like 10 for $1 most places. They are really, really cheap. You can use them in your pumpkins at Halloween time if you like to put out pumpkins with candles in them, but you can also take them out of their little metal container here. This one's going to be stubborn.
2 hours later.
So you take this candle little votive candle out of its little metal container. And if you've got a situation where your thread is trying to knot up on you, then what you do is you just hold the thread against the candle and pull it until it, can you see how it cut into the top there? And that coats the thread in that nice wax. And you want to run your fingers across it a couple of times. But that is going to keep it lubricated so that it doesn't try to knot up and tangle on you while you're working with it. So that would be my last recommendation. The only other thing that I will say is once you've got your beginner kit put together, feel free to decorate it. Have some fun, make it your own. Especially if you bought one of those pre-made kits, throw some stickers on it or something to help you identify it, because I guarantee you're not the only one who bought a pre-made kit. So that's all I've got for you on making your first sewing kit. Hit me up if you've got any questions.